All right. I guess let's get it started then. All right. Can you guys see clearly from your end?
Yeah, you're not showing your screen yet though with us.
All right. Anyone can see clearly?
Yep.
All right.
Yes.
All right. Cool. All right. Let's get it started. All right. Thanks everyone for coming in today, and welcome to another TorontoJS Tech Talk online event. And today, our guest speaker, Shruti Vellanki, will talk about the current state of cognitive accessibility. And first, please allow us to make a quick introduction about TorontoJS community. We are a volunteer-run nonprofit corporations that aim to support all in their journey to learn and share their passion for JavaScript, and by extension, software development. And we have 12,000 plus members on Meetup. We do both virtual and in-person events, 6,000 plus members on Slack, 1,000 plus members on Guild, and around 50 volunteers so far. So if you're interested in partner up, we can talk. You can send an email to sponsor@torontojs.com. And let's talk about upcoming events. This Saturday, April 27, we'll have a Code Club that will be hosted by Dale and Marco. And for next week, Tuesday, we're gonna have a big event for TorontoJS Lightning Talk. So make sure to RSVP at this QR code right there. Make sure not to miss all these wonderful events hosted by wonderful organizers. And let's talk about code of conduct. It's one of the most important things we should follow at all time. We are dedicated to providing an abuse-free, harassment-free event experience for everyone. We do not tolerance abuse, harassment, and any harmful way. And TorontoJS platform is not an endorsement of any particular ideology, and philosophy. And our object is providing a safe place for everyone. And so in the nutshell, please be nice to each other. And you can find the details at our official website, torontojs.com/pre/code of conduct. And if someone is harassing you in any way and you don't feel comfortable with someone, you can find me, Ken, Dale, and Liz. Or you can just report at the link right there, torontojs.com/pre/report. And yeah, thanks for coming. And if you're interested in involving the TorontoJS community more, make sure to check our Slack channel. And I guarantee you, you won't miss out. You'll have really good time to meet all of these wonderful like-minded developers there. So yeah, so while waiting for Serenity to set up the slides, please allow me to make a quick introduction. Serenity, our guest speaker, is currently a software engineer at Gen, formerly known as Northleaf Log and Everest. And she's passionate about front-end work, including the design system, component libraries, and accessibility. And speaking of accessibility for today, Serenity will dive right into the detailed world of cognitive accessibility, exploring all its aspects and clear guidelines established by groups like W3CS, COGA, and Finnish guidelines. And Sharon will also discuss the challenges in achieving universal accessibility due to the complexity of cognitive accessibility. And a fun fact, in her free time, she actively involved in and contributes to the W3C's Cognitive Accessibility Community Group, and really enjoy reading nonfiction as part of the Toronto Public Library's Culture and Technology Book Club. So yeah, let's welcome Serenity right there for being here and sharing her knowledges. So Serenity, please share your talk when you are ready.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Sammy, for the intro. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, hi everyone. As Sammy mentioned, today I want to cover what cognitive accessibility is and what it looks like in 2024. And what got me interested in this topic was actually being part of the W3C's Cognitive Accessibility Community Group, where I learned a lot about this topic. So yeah, hope to share stuff about it today. So let's just jump into it. When your product can be used by everyone, your product is accessible, and that's how I would define it in a nutshell. Usability, making things usable can get very complicated, and everyone, of course, includes people with disabilities, and we'll cover that pretty soon. Cognitive accessibility is accessibility focused on the human brain. So, addressing cognitive accessibility involves understanding how the brain processes information. So, how does the brain process information? Well, it starts with the senses. So, sight, sound, and touch are the ones we will cover today because it applies to user interactions. Oops. So, users interact with your product using their senses. They may use their sense of sight to read or watch content. They may use their sense of hearing to listen for notifications or to navigate content using the screen reader. For those of you who don't know, screen readers are used by low vision or blind users to have visual content read out to them. They may use their sense of touch to tap a button or read content with a refreshable braille display. And so a refreshable braille display is something that users who are low-sighted or blind could get feedback of like the content that's on the screen if they can't use a screen reader for whatever reason. So sight, sound, and touch are not enough for meaningful user interaction. So what does actually make meaningful user interaction? Because if you think about it, if you can see a sentence, you've not necessarily read it. If you've tapped a button, you've not necessarily meaningfully interacted with the app's functionality. Processing information is what actually leads to meaningful interaction. And processing is actually a set of skills in the brain. So the brain is your processor. So users' brains process sensory information using cognitive skills. Okay, what does this mean? So they may focus their attention, which is a cognitive skill, on key details when they've read something, or recall earlier instructions that they've heard from memory. Memory is also a cognitive skill. They may apply their skill of logic to navigate complex features, or their skill of reason to choose from available options. They may use the skill of language processing to understand text, or the skill of math processing to analyze data. So not all users, have the cognitive skills that your product requires. And this is where we touch on cognitive disability. So when the users doesn't have the skills that your product requires, your product is in a sense disabling to that user. And this disability could be momentary, temporary, or permanent. So what does that look like? Well, for example, a user with dyslexia will have a hard time reading text because of permanent problems with language processing. So as we touched on earlier, language processing being the cognitive skill. A user who had a bad night's sleep could have a temporary struggle with tasks that require logic and reasoning. So we see here that they might not necessarily have something diagnosed with them like dyslexia or ADHD or dementia, but they are still struggling with their product because of their bad night's sleep. And a user experiencing momentary distraction may have a hard time focusing their attention or recalling information from memory. So if you've ever just been momentarily sad because you, I don't know, got a bad text message, you could have problems with attention and memory, which could affect your ability to use a certain app or product. So the solution really here isn't to expect skills from users to be able to use your app. It's to require less from users. And the main way to do that is to follow the W3C's content usable guidelines. And these guidelines are specifically targeted to those with cognitive disabilities. So how do you actually require less from users? Well, tip number 1 is to be clear. How do you be clear? So here we'll be going over these little tips called objectives. And the reason I've called them objectives here is because that's how the guidelines have laid them out. These objectives, you can think of them as guidelines. You could, think of them as little almost goals that you can hit for your product. So objective number 1 is to help users understand what things are and how to use them. Objective number 2 is to help users find what they need on your product. And objective number 3 is to use clear and understandable content. And so that's how you be clear. Simple, right? Well, when actually building out your product or a feature, you can sort of see how these get complicated. So let's take the example of clear navigation. Clear navigation, that's pretty straightforward, right? It's when navigating your website is clear. Well, that breaks down into a lot of achievables or goals, just for this one kind of overarching goal of clear navigation. Sure, it's clear headings and categories, but it's also clear hierarchy as your layout laid out in order of importance. Is key information on your page highlighted? And then, it's probably a good idea on top of all of this to provide a search bar so that people can have a shorter way to search for what they want. But are those search suggestions clear? And if they are clear, are they too long? And if they're too long, are they categorized? So you'll notice if you go into Amazon search bar and type for something, search results will actually be categorized. And that makes it easier for you to navigate the search itself, which in turn helps you navigate the website. Tip number 2, to require less from users, is to avoid trouble. So help users avoid mistakes and know how to correct them. Ensure that processes don't rely on memory. And the best example to illustrate this, in my opinion, are forms. So forms are a minefield for users able to make errors in your product. So this is a crucial place where you can really address cognitive accessibility. So how do you make a safe form? So yes, make sure they have clear labels. Make sure your form has clear error messages. But also, have you thought of whether your form accepts different input formats? So let's say you have a date picker. Well, can you just click on the date picker to pick a date? Can you input it in a certain format? What about if you use dashes instead of slashes? Would your date picker accept that? Making sure it takes in all these formats is crucial to ensure safety of the forms and actually lessen the amount of work you require your users to do to like try and get your app to work. Make sure your form has undo or back options so that if someone doesn't enter something in the way that your form's expecting, they have the option to, not just exit out of your app. And make sure multi-step forms don't require memory. So if they're on a certain step, they've already entered information in the previous step, do they have to retain the information in their head while filling out the current step? If so, you're putting a cognitive strain on your user. And tip number 3 is to offer help. So help users focus. Provide help and support. And this usually looks like in the form of help text, but also maybe little tips throughout your app. Support adaptation and personalization. Okay, so what could this realistically look like? So image carousels are places that are notorious for being distracting. Actually, image carousels are just an accessibility minefield as a whole, but because we're focusing on cognitive accessibility, we'll talk about how distracting they are when they autoplay. So make sure your content doesn't autoplay. But also, in addition to having content that doesn't autoplay, which helps users focus, make sure the autoplay is opt-in. So could you kind of like opt into whether you want certain content to autoplay or not autoplay in your user settings? Well, that's an example of adaptation and personalization. And make sure your image carousel has clear controls. So it's obvious, when to go to next picture, previous picture, etc. And if your user interface is complicated for some reason, which hopefully it's not, make sure there are instructions available if necessary. Okay, so far we've been over how users use their senses to interact with your products and how the brain processes information using cognitive skills such as attention and memory. We've also been over how to reduce the cognitive strain on your users. And this is fine, right? Well, the solutions that we have so far, as I outlined in the W3C's guidelines, need to evolve, and they're going to evolve. So let's actually catch up to today, to 2024. The reason solutions that are currently out there, including the guidelines I just listed, need to evolve are because technological changes require new solutions. So a good example that we already have is chatbots. Chatbots are increasingly being used in websites to help with navigation. So chatbots could replace traditional navigation UIs to help users find what they want. So now, instead of having your guidelines centered around what does a good search look like, or what does a good layout look like to help the users get around your websites, maybe you want to shift that focus more and more towards what does a helpful chatbot look like? Maybe you could have them both together. Okay, so in addition to having to account for that in your guidelines, we have to think, how could chatbots actually help cognitive accessibility? One way I could think of right now is that chatbots usually, like, at least if you look at AIs like ChatGPT, you could maybe customize their tone a little bit so that users feel like they're having a friendlier interaction on their website. But if you don't have those customization options, you could actually hurt cognitive accessibility if users feel like the results they're getting from the chatbot isn't very clear. So it's an area to think about. Technological change will require these guidelines to change because the guidelines are very rooted in current website layouts or increasingly outdated ones. Number 2, cognitive skills are being hijacked. You see this on the news all the time where, you know, our attention spans are being strained and tested. There's social media addiction and so forth, which basically means people have fewer and fewer mental resources left to navigate your product. So an example is social media addiction, as I mentioned. The US Surgeon General actually issued an advisory on teen social media addiction. And this is really problematic because now not only do teens have fewer cognitive skills, namely attention, to focus on interactions within products that you may design, but also the products they are using, social media apps, are actively draining their cognitive skills for day-to-day resources. And this is because tech companies have figured this out. What we're trying to do with cognitive skills in a good way, tech companies have engineered so that they can sort of hijack it and use it for profit. So this is an example of how the guidelines need to evolve, maybe turn into laws to protect vulnerable populations against these sorts of things. And the last way the guidelines need to catch up is to catch up to the growing understanding of disability. So an example of this would be our growing understanding of fear and cognition. You know, when we talk about cognitive accessibility, we think a lot about things like ADHD, maybe we think about intellectual disabilities, maybe we think about dementia. But the focus isn't there all too much on the emotional aspect of the user's experience. And the emotional aspect can play in quite a bit when someone's using an app. So for example, users with ADHD, which we talk about all the time, at least in relation to cognitive accessibility, often experience fear of failure when using an app or product that's too complicated. And we don't talk about this fear of failure often. Fear of failure could actually deter them from using your product, or it could just add another mental stress that actually makes it harder to use your product. Like if you've ever been nervous for a test, you perform poorer on it. So what are the solutions? Well, there have been solutions that are being proposed currently by the W3C's community group related to cognitive accessibility about embedding certain things like positive affirmations throughout the app to, you know, give something encouraging to users, or to provide things like time estimates or task estimates to tell users like, hey, here, just so you know, here's what to expect in terms of how long this flow is going to take, or just so you know, this is how effortful this process is going to be for you. And revealing that upfront actually decreases fear for users, which is great. And that's also something that should definitely make its way to the guidelines. So yeah, that sort of concludes my talk. So far we've covered that we need to understand how the brain actually processes information when users interact with your products. We need to address this using the guidelines that are out there to help require less cognitive skills from your users. And we need to adapt our solutions to current demands, both in society, to growing understanding of disability, and hopefully just be on our toes to serve our users better and better, and to make products accessible. Yeah, that's it. I've included references here. So here is good introductory articles from the Mozilla Developer Network, as well as DQ. It's a great intro guide on cognitive accessibility. The official resource you might be looking for is this one. And if you want resources on current issues, I've linked 2 articles about social media and youth mental health, as well as a working draft on fear and cognitive accessibility by the community group. Yeah, questions?
Tigana has a question. Go ahead, Tigana.
I really enjoyed the talk. I was curious, do you have an example of a form that achieves the safe form objectives that you described earlier, like a web page we can look at?
Oh, that's a really good question. I don't have one on me right now, but if you go to the content usable guidelines, they have a whole bunch of little tips in a scenario form for how that form could look like. But a tangible form, like in a link, I don't have on me. I could certainly Google it and send that to you after.
Yeah, that'd be great. How could I reach out to you?
I will share my LinkedIn in the chat as soon as I figure out how to do so.
Okay, no, take your time.
But for now, I'm going to actually copy and paste this link.
So we have 3 more questions. So Elizabeth, Dan, and Dale in that order, when you're ready.
I'll wait till Shruti's done. That's cognitive accessibility. Let me know when you're ready.
Hello?
Are you muted?
Hi, I'm sorry, am I audible?
Yeah, you're audible. Sorry.
Sorry about that. Yeah,
Hi, I'm another accessibility professional and former ed tech specialist.
hello.
Yes, also disabled. So something that people are missing recently because it's newer about cognitive accessibility is the impact of COVID on that. This would be me. This would be one of the main reasons I'm getting a wheelchair finally. I'm going to share in the chat a very good article that's accessible to people without a biology background about POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Sorry, I'm going to get medical and I will explain it. It's a form of dysautonomia. And so when you stand up, most people's bodies work and their brains work, and their brains work to circulate blood through your body, digestion, a whole bunch of other things. When you have dysautonomia, it's a dysfunction of things that are automatic in your body, including blood circulation. And who knew you need oxygen in your brain to think well? So I'll share the article. People can ask me later about it, but literally I get aphasia. I'm a published writer. I taught for almost 2 decades. Like I've worked, you know, I've got multiple university degrees. Get me standing up, ask me a question, can't answer it. Sit down for a few minutes, perfectly fine, usually. So it's just really interesting. And the thing is, because it affects people with hypermobility, and 20% of the population is hypermobile, and more women than men, it's also gendered. So it's also about being accessible and not discriminatory on at least two levels. So, and do take a look, because that's only increasing, because COVID's not going away. People are still getting COVID for the first time. And if you happen to be hypermobile, you're 30% less likely to recover than the other 80% of the population. So.
Thank you so much for sharing that. That's a very good point. Like intersectionality plays such a big role when addressing disabilities, and fortunately my talk hasn't covered that, but
Okay.
yeah, I like it's hard because when certain things are maybe not as known to the general public, addressing these things, at least in the context of apps or tech, isn't as intuitive to the people who are supposed to be addressing it. The more and more examples we have of things like you mentioned that aren't the intuitive, you know, oh, ADHD, dyslexia, that sort of like list you have, the better, I think, to make things accessible in general. So yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that.
Disability isn't static. Even if you have a permanent disability, what happens day to day, hour to hour, week to week changes and doesn't get worse or better. It just is. And so it's kind of like living a random number generator. Right? So just keep that in mind, that one day your users, the exact same population of users, may be able to use your app and the other day they won't.
Sure.
The day that they won't might be the day they're making a purchasing decision or telling their family that they couldn't use your app. So anyway, I will let other people talk.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think Dale also has a question.
Yes. I could be unlucky, but in my experience, especially at like medium to large size companies, the stakeholders involved in designing, I guess, or doing UX for apps or sites almost never think about this kind of stuff. If they do think about accessibility, it's kind of in like the shallow like ARIA label kind of way. Do you have any tips on how to introduce these concepts to the people who probably need to know them the most, like designers and product managers?
Yeah, so I got this question at the last talk too. I was forthcoming with like the bad news that it is hard to get that buy-in, but the two ways I've found some success is number one, tying it to the bottom line. So that's like kind of like the stick approach where it's sort of like, hey, there are actual lawsuits that come about as a result of this. You know, you could lose out on a whole chunk of users if you don't address this, because a lot more of the population has some form of disability than you might imagine. And then the other piece that I've found is sort of successful is saying, hey, I sometimes have a hard time with this, or I have family members who have disabilities who have a hard time with this. And yeah, tying it to a personal story, I find makes people more empathic than just having it like floating out there as a vague, like you should do good for society kind of a message. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, that second one's actually pretty good. I'm going to use that. Thanks.
Shruti, I'd like to ask a question. I think you're talking to a crowd of engineers, developers, and I think most people here know that, you know, there are certain things that we can do and practices that make it easier for people with disability. But at the same time, I think we're all aware that we need to do a lot more. And on a personal level, with a person with a neurological disability, I've had to experience asking for accommodations in the past, and I found this process to be very dehumanizing and difficult. So I've kind of taken the solutions into my own hands. It's just been easier than trying to get help, you know, from a business, for example. So is there like a silver lining? Are we seeing like improvement in certain fields in the last 5 years, or are we still kind of struggling across the board? And have the solutions been more about getting sued, or have technologies made it easier for companies to make their software accessible?
Ooh, there is so much to unpack here. I feel like there is a silver lining in that, at least like even amongst the people who aren't super aware of social issues in my circle, there's been more recognition of disability rights as a civil right issue. There's been more recognition by tech companies about the importance of accessibility. It really helps when, you know, giants like Microsoft focus so much effort into these areas. And there is like this community group meets every month, for example, and the working group, for those of you who don't know, working groups by the W3C are like the more official version, and community groups, anyone can sort of go and participate. They are constantly iterating on these guidelines. So yes, understanding is growing. But then on the flip side, I feel like things that are making it harder on people to navigate society are also growing. So an example is social media hijacking attention. So I feel like there's almost an arms race from my perspective of, yes, things are getting better, but things are also getting worse all the time. And it's a matter of keeping up with the changes in society from where I'm seeing it. I don't know if that answered all of your questions.
Yeah, I think it was a kind of a huge basket of question marks. I found your comments about you know, how applications have become very addictive and captured all the attention, and now that's becoming an issue with governments because it's probably affecting productivity versus other countries, right? So there's some really interesting stories here.
Yeah, that's a great point. Like almost back to the bottom line piece, but on a policy level.
Do we have more questions before we move to networking? Anyone?
I want to ask some question.
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, Shruti. Thanks for the talk. That's very informative. So my question is about the addiction of social media as well. So I thought, like, for example, if I look at Instagram for a couple hours, then I haven't thought about that, but now I think you can actually feel like your cognitive capacity like decrease as the time goes by.
Mm-hmm.
But I haven't thought about that way yet. But is there any discussion around that kind of thing? I thought it's an interesting topic.
That's a really good question. We haven't discussed it in the community group, or it hasn't been discussed as far as I know, but there is like general info floating around. Again, not cited sources, but I have seen that the maximum amount of time you can focus on anyone, like do deep work in a day, is 4 hours. So you are operating with limited resources all the time. So anytime your attention is being drained by anything, that is less attention later in the day to focus on what you need to focus. So definitely like Instagram tiring you out mentally checks out in my opinion, and leaves you with less resources to work with the rest of the day. But I will look into that specifically as it relates to social media, and then like its effect on like performing certain tasks, because I think having an official paper to back up what I just said would be nice. Yeah.
Thanks. Something I thought also was there's some discussion about like the accessibility technology in recent years receive lots of attention because they are incorporated into mainstream technologies. For example, like a voice assistance, right? It used to be part of like medical, maybe something like that, but now it's like a mainstream. But also if you think about like social media, one can imagine like an argument saying that because apps are so easy to use, they don't require like, it's so accessible, they don't require you as a user to perform anything. You just stare at it. Which actually makes it really addictive, right? That's just something I thought kind of interesting to think about, I guess.
Like almost the how user friendly and accessible they are is the thing causing disabling. Yeah,
exactly, causing the distraction or addictiveness.
I guess Yeah, I guess here defining what the end goal for a person's well-being and keeping that in mind is also maybe important to guidelines and discussions around it. The only guideline I have seen in Content Usable that explicitly takes into account the user's well-being is one about disclose hidden fees or like disclose transaction fees at the beginning of a transaction to users. And that was the only one that said, hey, you know, we need to care about someone's financial health in this case. But most of the guidelines are definitely geared to say, help them successfully achieve this app. So
That's right.
I
Yeah.
think if the guidelines were framed more in terms of people's well-being, there might be more of like a nuanced approach to, hey, this is super user-friendly and usable, but is this actually good for them? And that's something I'm going to bring up now. Thank you for bringing that point up.
Yeah, thanks for the info.
I think Dan go next.
Hi, thank you very much. Very informative, and I appreciate the talk. My question is like, when you're saying you might be better to provide some recognition or some estimation for the user when they're using the app in order to encourage them or provide some cognitive assurance for the users. But sometimes I would get the feedbacks like too much info for some other users will feel too redundant. How to draw a line in too much info on the app that will be causing discomfort, or people will be frustrated with the excessive information, and sometimes it might be needed for some other users. That's something in when designing an app or trying to use an app will be facing this kind of situations, I think.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point, and I think this is where the part about adaptation and personalization really comes in. It was also one of the objectives. So absolutely, like for some users having a certain time estimate text saying this process will take 2 minutes is going to be amazing, and then for certain others that might lead to too much clutter on the page, which makes it harder to read and navigate, right? So if there was something like a user settings that said opt in to help text around times or whatever else it may be, just the option to have it or not would kind of cover everyone. So multiple options, like as many as you can provide, I think is probably the only good solution here, because designing one solution that captures everyone is really, really hard, and I would even say impossible.
I see. Yeah, I think there's a big questions and problems sometimes to tackle with. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I think that will be the last question before we move to networking. Awesome talk, Shruti. Honestly, I was, you can tell that as we progress in this conversation that we're going in a lot of unexpected places. So a lot of interesting topic for discussions. Sammy, would you like to maybe split up the room and so that we can get to know each other a bit better?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Just give me a second. Let's do that. And this just a heads up, the networking time will be 20 minutes. Before we back to the main room, it will show us like 1 minute countdown. So keep an eye on that. Let me see here. So how
If
do you,
anyone would like to network, please feel free to share your LinkedIn in chat.
I think 3 should be good.